Welcome and thank you for joining us this morning for Issues and Views, Buffalo, New York's weekly public affairs program focusing on topics and concerns that affect you and your community. We hope the information you hear today is beneficial to you. Now here's your Issues and Views host, Todd Anderson.
Good morning and welcome to Issues and Views. I'm your host, Todd Anderson, and we have two guests with us today from Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center. Dr. Christine Ambrosoni, she's the Senior Vice President of Population Sciences at Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center, and Dr. Deborah Irwin, she's the Associate Director for Community Outreach and Engagement at Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center. And welcome both of you to Issues and Views today. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Our pleasure.
Thank you.
We're going to focus today on breast cancer as it applies to African American women. And the first question I'd like to ask either one of you, both of you, I know that Dr. Ambrosoni, you are the research part of this, and Dr. Irwin, you take that research and put it into practice. Is that correct?
That's correct. And
Okay.
we also do community-based research.
Okay. So I'd like to ask you to begin with, when breast cancer forms in women, how does it affect women from different backgrounds differently?
So the first thing to understand is that breast cancer is really not just one disease. There are two major different types. One is called estrogen receptor positive and one estrogen receptor negative. And if tumors are ER positive, they can be treated with anti-estrogens. They have a much better prognosis. Whereas for ER negative breast cancers, there are less available treatment options. Now, African American women are more likely to be diagnosed with this ER-negative breast cancer, again, that can't be treated with anti-estrogens, and they're more likely to be diagnosed at a younger age. And we've known for a long time that Black women are more likely to die of breast cancer, and there are a lot of factors that play into it. One, though, is probably because the tumors tend to be more aggressive.
Now, has there been any research done as to why the death rate is so high among Black women?
Well, one reason may be because they are more likely to be diagnosed with tumors that tend to be more aggressive, and there are less treatment options. But there are many other factors that may play into it.
Right. Many times Black women are not diagnosed at an earlier stage where it's more treatable. And there is also some research that demonstrates that sometimes Black women with the ER-negative breast cancers may have a negative mammogram, a normal mammogram, and then within 6 months, this tumor tends to grow very fast or show up differently when they have it. And a lot of women that are at high risk actually are encouraged to have MRIs in addition to mammograms for diagnosing breast cancer at its earliest stages.
There are also some concerns about whether or not Black women get adequate optimal treatment. And there are a lot of, like if you need radiation therapy, you have to go every day for 6 weeks. And if someone's got a full-time job they can't get away from, kids they can't get daycare for every day, this could be an issue.
Absolutely. Access to health care is a major issue. In fact, it's very interesting that the greatest disparities between the survival rate with white women and African American women started in the 1980s. Late 70s and 80s, and that is when we started having what we call adjuvant therapy, which is the chemotherapy and radiation for treatment of breast cancer, and it really increased. And the access to that and the completion of adequate treatment for women started being different, and that's when the death rate started increasing for Black women, whereas it started being reduced for white women and has been reduced consistently more for white women over the last 30 years.
So I have a question. The American Cancer Society and what they recommend, I think it was last year they came up with a reduced age in terms of when you should get a mammogram, I believe. I think it's age 55 or something. Or
It's
50.
actually age 40.
Oh, 40?
Women should begin having a mammogram at age 40.
Yeah, but that's not what the American Cancer Society
Well,
said.
they had moved it to 50,
So that's what I mean. So what I'm asking you is the American Cancer Society has recommended that women start getting checked at age 50. However, African American women develop cancer at an earlier age. So why isn't the recommendation 40?
Todd, that's a really good question. And I think what this comes down to is really more about financial and political issues. And I hate to say that because cancer should not be politicized in any way. Insurance companies have maintained, and Medicare or Medicaid will support screening from 40 on, that we certainly, in all of our outreach, all of our materials, all of our information, we strongly encourage at least a baseline mammogram by age 40 and clinical breast exams. And we also encourage women who are at high risk, that's women who have breast cancer within their family, to actually consult with physicians and see if they may qualify for actually having a mammogram or at least seeking care. Because many women have challenges when they're younger and their breasts are very fibrous for having mammograms and having them adequately read. And so one of the things that we encourage is going to a specialist, a surgeon. We have a high-risk clinic at Roswell Park for breast cancer, and actually having somebody see you in person annually or every 6 months, even when you're in your 30s or even sometimes in their 20s if they have a high risk of breast cancer, so that somebody is monitoring that and that they can use the MRI, which I mentioned, magnetic resonance imaging, to screen these women rather than just the mammogram, because it's easier to read and it's more accurate, particularly for the triple negative and the ER negative breast cancers.
So now you talked about financials, and I think there's an issue with insurances paying for these services if they're done prior to the recommendation of the American Cancer Society, right?
Well, not if their primary care physician and or their surgeon that they're seeing says that they're at high risk. Then they will qualify. And that's even true for the New York State Cancer Services Program, which provides free mammography for women who are uninsured.
Actually, I was just given the guidelines for the ACS, and they say women at average risk for breast cancer, all women should begin having annual mammograms by age 45 and can change to having mammograms every other year beginning at age 55. It's maybe new guidelines. But the years and years ago, I skipped a couple mammograms, and when I went to see the radiologist, he said, well, why haven't you been here? And I said, well, the new ACS guidelines say blah, blah, blah. And he said, look, if you had a tumor that developed 6 months after I saw you last, do you want to wait another year and a half until it's diagnosed? And so a lot of the guidelines are based upon overall cost benefit at a national population level and not at the individual level. Because if you're walking around with breast cancer, you want it diagnosed early.
Are there any signs of breast cancer that a woman can look for? I know you can check yourself, but is beyond that, are there any symptoms?
Well, you don't want to have it diagnosed when you have symptoms. You want to find it before that. But there are signs and symptoms, lumps, differences in the nipple changes, the POTA orange, or the kind of a puckering of the tissue, the breast tissue, differences in the way they look. And we actually, to your point, we actually still within the Witness Project, which is our outreach program for African American women, and for Esperanza y Vida that we do for Hispanic women, we encourage breast self-examination for younger women, because if you're 28 or you're 30 years old, you can't get a mammogram. You may or may not be getting a good clinical breast exam from your physician. And if you examine your breast every month, even though it's not a screening, that's not screening, but it is breast awareness, and it does note changes. You may see a difference in a nipple. You may feel something different, and then you can go in. And some women also who have cystic breasts, that is, they have tend to have benign cysts that grow in their breasts. it's really important for them because they can tell a difference between how something felt last month and they know their breasts the best.
And then this issue about women not being screened when they're younger, I've heard stories, and we have a large study of breast cancer in African American women, and we've heard stories of women who were diagnosed in their 20s. And they went to the doctor, and the doctor said, "Oh, that's nothing, you're too young." And then they went back the next year, "Oh, you're too young." And, advocate for yourself and get a mammogram, and then they're diagnosed with the late-stage breast cancer.
So now you, Dr. Irwin, you said that you can't get a mammogram in your 20s and 30s?
Well, unless you're at high risk. I mean, for example, you have a breast cancer history in your family is one of the ways they identify high risk. So if you don't have breast cancer in your family, but you're 25 years old, it would behoove you, it would benefit you to just do breast examinations every month or so, right after your period, so that you just know what your breasts feel like and you would recognize anything earlier.
Historically, white women had a higher incidence of breast cancer, and African American women had lower risk. And as risk has decreased for white women, mainly because of taking hormone therapy, that really increased risk for older, primarily white women were using it. Once the news came out that that was not a good thing to do and you stopped, you could see those breast cancer rates in white women drop. And now rates in black women and white women have met. So they're about the same in black women and white women, partly because rates have been going down in white women.
And also, Todd, it wouldn't really, I think, change. I don't know if it would change or not, but having mammograms for women who are only 25, 30 years old are not very effective. They're hard to read. They have fibrous breasts.
In terms of muscle tissue?
Breast density is a risk factor for breast cancer, but that's more having more cells that are at risk for developing tumors. But dense breasts are harder to image on mammograms.
Right. And a good reason for doing self-examination, because then you get familiar with how your breasts feel every month and recognize differences. But I don't know that the idea of African-American women needing to – there has been a lot of discussion about moving mammograms up. I mean, there's in researchers that do work with African Americans, we've talked about it, but we politically and financially, that's a real challenge.
So for a young African American woman listening right now who's in her 20s and 30s, what would you recommend they do?
They should be doing breast self-examination. I mean, that's not a screening, but they just should be familiar with their breasts so they can see any changes. They need to go annually if they're going for their PAP. They should also have the breast exam by a clinician, which is a clinical breast exam. And then they should know their family history. And then most of all, if and when they do have children, they should breastfeed.
In terms of self-examination, is there any video or anything online on your website that shows women how to do self-examination? Or can they get that information somewhere by visiting Roswell?
Yes, if they go to, for example, if they're high risk and they're in the clinic, and or if they go to Roswell for a mammogram, they can ask to be instructed on how to conduct a self-examination themselves. And also, we certainly teach that in the Witness Project outreach program.
Now, so you're saying that breastfeeding reduces the risk of breast cancer?
So it has, in some studies, been shown to reduce it overall. But several years ago, well, almost 10 years ago now, there was a study that was conducted in white and black women in a very large study in North Carolina. And when they looked by what I was saying, estrogen receptor positive, which is what older women, white women tend to get more, and estrogen receptor negative. And we always said that having children reduced risk of breast cancer. Most of the studies were done in white women, older women, and that was true. The more kids you had, the lower your risk of breast cancer. But when The Carolina breast cancer study looked by estrogen receptor status. This was only true for ER positive, that older women, more white women get. And actually having children increased risk of ER negative, which is more aggressive, and it's what black women more often get. But amazingly, if women breastfed, there was no increased risk with having kids, which it just knocked my socks off. Why isn't this on the front pages? This is so important. If risk increases a lot of aggressive breast cancer with having kids, but goes away if you breastfeed, everybody needs to know that. So we conducted this really large study with thousands of black women with breast cancer, thousands of controls, and we saw the same thing, that having children reduced risk of ER positive, which black women get too. The majority of women get ER positive, but increased risk of this ER negative, and breastfeeding really took it away. So we've been making major efforts to get this word out.
Now, is that what the National Witness Project is all about?
Well, yes, we have changed our curriculum. And Todd, let me just go back and also let your listeners know that at roswellpark.org, Dr. Young has put information about breast self-exams, the first line of defense, and information about how to perform it and where to perform it and how often and everything. So we do have something on the website. This information and these results that Dr. Ambersoni just reported on, this is one of the few times, there are so few things, items, variables that we can tell women that can actually reduce your risk of breast cancer and that actually might prevent breast cancer. We don't talk about prevention normally for breast cancer until now. And for the last 30 years, we've been telling black women that their risks are the same as white women.
Right.
Oh, having children early, having multiple children reduces your risk, and as you said, it doesn't. So we have changed the curriculum and the educational programming for the Witness Project to really focus on these specific risks for African American women for breast cancer. We also go over the risk for human papillomavirus and cervical cancer as well, but that's just the second part. Once we have women in a room, we like to cover the breast and cervical cancer issues. And so we have now talked about this, and this is very interesting because parity, or having multiple children, and we don't want to tell women not to have as many children as they want to have. But at the same time, the recognition that breastfeeding is not just good nutrition for the baby and healthy for you, et cetera, that it may actually reduce risks for this particular aggressive type of cancer is all new. We've piloted this curriculum. We piloted in with our Witness Project programs. We have sites in 18 places around the United States, and we piloted it with our Buffalo group, New York City, in Harlem, and also in Arkansas, to get a real mix of types of women that we would reach, et cetera. And we've done this with over 330 women, and it showed overwhelmingly that this was absolutely new information. The women hadn't heard this before, and the knowledge increase was really significant. It was information and data that pre and post doing an educational program that I haven't seen since about the 1980s.
So breastfeeding these days, I think I was breastfed, but I don't remember. But I think, well, I know that if I was, and I believe I was breastfed, there wasn't the same equipment that is available today. So it's a little easier today, right?
Well, it can be easier. It is still a real challenge, particularly for women that are working in hourly jobs that don't have a lounge to go to and privacy, et cetera. But legally in New York State, they're supposed to be provided that. And Medicaid now covers, and WIC both provide pumps for women to be able to pump when they're away from the baby and can go home and then leave breast milk for them, et cetera. But African American women are the least likely racial ethnic group to breastfeed.
Right.
So we have.
Why is that?
Well, there's a historical precedent.
Is there some stigma attached to it or something?
There has been, and part of this actually came out of the legacy and historical legacy of slavery, because African American women were asked to be wet nurses for white women's babies, so
Wow.
that was seen as negative. Why would you do that? There's been kind of a cultural change over the years that even in the 20th century and then now, that this isn't, that breasts are not really for nurturing children. They're more of a sexual entity.
Really?
And so a lot of families, a lot of people don't really want to see people breastfeeding, and
Right.
they don't want to do that. So there has been some negative connotations to it. But it seems to be turning around a little, certainly with more of the natural food issues and those kind of things. People are more interested in it. And I'm hoping that if family members that are kind of like, ooh, I don't want to see you breastfeed, or you have to stay, in the back room when you do this, et cetera, can think about this in terms of, well, it also may be reducing this woman's risk of breast cancer, that they'll be more accepting of it.
There was a big change in maybe the 40s, 50s, and people who could afford it, higher SES people, started bottle feeding their babies. And they thought it was greatest thing since sliced bread. And you had a lot more convenience than putting the babies on schedule. And it wasn't really, I think, until like the 70s, 80s maybe, that these more highly educated people started coming around and realizing, oh, breastfeeding's really better than bottle feeding. And I think it's taken a long time to catch on with everybody, and maybe less among black women.
Yeah. For example, I don't know how old you are, Todd, but I'm probably older than you are. And my mother didn't breastfeed me and thought it was disgusting. Yeah. And then when I wanted to breastfeed my daughter, she was like, "Oh, that's disgusting." And so we need to change back to thinking of breast is best.
Breast milk is good total nutrition for a baby for about a year. You don't really need to start introducing solids until maybe 6 months, and then they could live on breast milk for at least a year. But the content of the breast milk changes almost like every week, every month, and it starts out like really high in fat because that's what the baby needs, and then generally the composition changed more, different proportions of fat and protein. So a woman's milk is like made specifically for her baby, and will change as the baby grows.
And boosts the immune system. And
yeah.
Wow, God is really good.
Let me also add,
God knew what he was doing, didn't he?
God knew what he was doing. I also want to add that a lot of women who are now have their children are grown, and I know in the from the pilot study that we did, it's like, oh my God, well, I had 5 children and I didn't breastfeed. So does that mean I'm going to get aggressive breast cancer? And no, it's not a one-to-one correspondence with this risk. Overall, we know that this can reduce risk, but we don't want women thinking, oh, I'm doomed to have breast cancer now because I had 5 children and I didn't breastfeed any of them. But certainly encouraging their children and their grandchildren to, and then those women that have grown children or are no longer childbearing and aren't breastfeeding just need to do breast self-examination and get their mammograms.
Is there anything guys can do to help?
Absolutely. They need to encourage women, because I often say women don't breastfeed in a vacuum. The father of the child, the partner, the husband, the fathers, the grandparents really need to encourage that woman and make it as easy as possible. And we're doing a study right now. We have a pilot study that's funded by the National Cancer Institute that we're collaborating with WIC, Women, Infant, Children, to encourage women, young women that were pregnant, to breastfeed. And, we hear a lot of comments, and we have a social media piece of this intervention trying to encourage women. And one of the things that we hear, like, oh, but if I breastfeed, nobody will keep my baby because then they think it'll be a nipple baby and they won't take a bottle and they won't do this and that. And so being able to work that out, and sometimes it is hard for babies to adjust to a bottle, but almost all of them will do that. And you can freeze or keep the milk and they'll have it. And so the family members and the support network for the woman really need to encourage that and say, no, we can do this. We can keep the baby. We can manage when you're not there.
And awareness of breast cancer. In this large study we have of women with breast cancer, we asked them how their breast cancer was detected. And a large number of women say their partner found it. And so men should also be aware of breast cancer. And if, they feel a lump, they should bring it up.
My last question is, we talk a lot about African American and white women with respect to breast cancer, but there Asian women and Hispanic women have breast too.
So Asian women, they're categorized as Asian Pacific Islander, and they have lower rates of breast cancer. And when they get breast cancer, they have lower rates of mortality. And we're not really sure why. Now, Hispanic women can have a large proportion of African ancestry or be mostly white. So they don't have the same rates as African American women, but if they're in kind of lower socioeconomic categories, they may have higher mortality. Some studies show that they have higher risk of more aggressive breast cancers, but not all. And that may be because of their ancestry.
Yeah, it's weird how financial status affects that, right?
It does.
I want to add that too. Poverty trumps everything, actually, in terms of
survival. So is that because of nutrition?
Survival. It's a combination of exposures. It's a combination of, nutrition, what people eat, obesity rates, exercise, being able to... Education and income are the two greatest social determinants of how long you live.
Now, you said exercise. Does that help?
Yes. Exercise reduces risk of breast cancer. Exercise reduces risk of most cancers, heart disease, diabetes. It increases likelihood that you're going to live once you're diagnosed with cancer. Exercise is really good. And people at our place are showing that you don't have to go out and run a marathon compared to people who are totally sedentary. People who do any exercise have lower risk. So,
just walking.
Get up and walk,
Okay, well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but a lot of information here with respect to breast cancer and how it affects African American women. The website is, again,
roswellpark.org. And if women need a mammogram, they can call 1-800-ROSWELL. That's 1-800-767-9355. And if women want to schedule a Witness Project program, a breast cancer education program for themselves or for their organization or church, that would be 845-3383.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for all of this information. Hope you guys will come back and talk to us again. We've been talking with Dr. Christine Ambrosoni. She's the Senior Vice President of Population Sciences at Roswell Park, and also Dr. Deborah Irwin. She's the Associate Director for Community Outreach and Engagement at Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center. And once again, thank you guys for coming, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The views, opinions, and comments expressed on the program are those of the participants and not necessarily of this station.